Volume 6, The Reformation, by Will Durant, Part 1. Copyright 1957, by Will Durant. Copyright renewed 1985, by Ethel B. Durant. This recording of the full-length reading of The Reformation was published by arrangement with Monica Ariel Mile, Trustee Ethel B. Durant Trust, Monica Ariel Mile and William James Durant Easton, and was produced in 1997 by Books on Tape Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any part thereof may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authority from Books on Tape Incorporated. This book is read by Alexander Adams. Please observe the following procedures as you listen to these tapes. If you have borrowed this book from your local library, please return it to them at the end of the agreed period. If you are one of our regular rental customers, you may keep your book for 30 days from date of receipt by you, but after that time we charge additional rental of 25 cents per day. Dates are checked by postmark. Please return this book at the earliest possible time, so another subscriber can have the use of this recording. To return cassettes to us, simply make sure they are all packaged in their plastic cassette cases and in proper order in the mailing container. Kindly seal the mailing container for return. Postage is already paid. Drop in any mailbox for return to Books on Tape. Should a cassette fail to play properly, hold it flat in the palm of your hand and slap it smartly against a hard flat surface. If this does not work, or if you cannot otherwise free the reels, and if you are a library customer, please ask your local library to contact Books on Tape for a replacement cassette. If you are one of our rental customers, please call us at our regular customer service number. Give us the name of the book and number of the cassette. We will immediately send you a replacement at no charge. Discard the broken cassette. The Reformation, by Will Durant. This book consists of 39 chapters and is 940 pages long. Part 1 consists of chapters 1 through 15. The following material appears on the dust jacket of the book. A History of European Civilization from Wycliffe to Calvin, 1300 to 1564. In Volume 6 of The Story of Civilization, Will Durant surveys the people and ideas, the beliefs, and the world-shaking conflicts of the age of the Reformation. It is both a self-contained and independent study of the Reformation, perhaps the most important event in modern history, and at the same time a continuation of Dr. Durant's monumental work of history. In this volume, Will Durant recaptures and illuminates the living drama of an age as beset with revolution as our own. He finds social revolution accompanying religious revolution in nearly every phase of the Reformation, and it is from this untraditional standpoint of two concurrent dramas that he has written this book. He begins by considering religion in general, its function in the soul and the group, and the conditions and problems of the Roman Catholic Church in the 2 centuries before Luther. He observes England, Germany, and Bohemia, rehearsing the ideas and conflicts of the Lutheran Reformation, and considers sympathetically the efforts of Erasmus for the peaceful self-reform of the Church. The Reformation proper then holds the stage, with Luther and Melanchthon in Germany, Zwingli and Calvin in Switzerland, Henry VIII in England, Knox in Scotland, and Gustavus Vasa in Sweden. Next he looks at the strangers in the gate, Russia and the Ivans, and the Orthodox Church, Islam and its challenging creed, culture, and power, and the struggle of the Jews to find Christians in Christendom. He takes us behind the scenes to study the law and economy, morals and manners, art and music, literature, science, and philosophy of Europe in the age of Luther. Finally, Dr. Durant makes an experiment in empathy, an attempt to view the Reformation from the standpoint of the imperiled Church. In a brief epilogue, considering the Renaissance and the Reformation, Catholicism and the Enlightenment in the large perspective of modern history and thought, he makes an honest effort to be impartial on a highly controversial subject, though admitting that nothing is so irritating as impartiality. In the Reformation, Dr. Durant once again illuminates and humanizes, with eloquence, scrupulous but luminous scholarship, and calm wisdom, the men and women behind the faiths and embattled forces of their time. The age was one of towering personalities, and Durant has made nearly all of them the subject of revealing vignettes. Wycliffe, Hus, Joan of Arc, Villon, Ferdinand and Isabella, Columbus, Magellan, Erasmus, Luther, Dürer, Holbein, Calvin, Knox, Francis I, Charles V, Diane de Poitiers, Catherine de' Medici, Henry VIII, Thomas More, Bloody Mary, who in her early reign is here called the Gentle Queen, Ivan the Terrible, Hafiz, Tamerlane, Suleiman the Magnificent, Rabelais, Hans Sachs, Gutenberg, Copernicus, Vesalius, Leo X, St. Ignatius Loyola, St. Teresa of Avila. Here are kings and popes, rebels and heretics, geniuses and destroyers, saints and cynics, artists, philosophers, and scientists, the makers and movers of their time seen both intimately and in their power and glory. The present is the past rolled up for action, and the past is the present unrolled for our understanding. Throughout the book, this majestic sense of continuity and perspective, of the eternal and the ephemeral, guides Will Durant as, considering the age of the Reformation, he attempts to unravel the present into its constituent past. Dedication to Louis, Molly, and Eric. To the reader. The prospective reader deserves a friendly notice that the Reformation is not quite an honest title for this book. An accurate title would be A History of European Civilization Outside of Italy from 1300 to 1564, or thereabouts, including the history of religion in Italy and an incidental view of Islamic and Judaic civilization in Europe, Africa, and Western Asia. Why so meandering a thematic frontier? Because Volume 4, The Age of Faith, in this story of civilization, brought European history only to 1300, and Volume 5, The Renaissance, confined itself to Italy, 1304 to 1576, deferring the Italian echoes of the Reformation. So this Volume 6 must begin at 1300, and the reader will be amused to find that Luther arrives on the scene only after a third of the tale has been told. But let us privately agree that the Reformation really began with John Wycliffe and Louis of Bavaria in the 14th century, progressed with John Hus in the 15th, and culminated explosively in the 16th with the reckless monk of Wittenberg. Those whose present interest is only in the religious revolution may omit chapters 3 through 6 and 9 and 10 without irreparable loss. The Reformation, then, is the central but not the only subject of this book. We begin by considering religion in general, its functions in the soul and the group, and the conditions and problems of the Roman Catholic Church in the 2 centuries before Luther. We shall watch England in 1376 to 1382, Germany in 1320 to 1347, and Bohemia in 1402 to 1485, rehearsing the ideas and conflicts of the Lutheran Reformation. And as we proceed, we shall note how social revolution, with communistic aspirations, marched hand in hand with the religious revolt. We shall weakly echo Gibbon's chapter on the fall of Constantinople, and shall perceive how the advance of the Turks to the gates of Vienna made it possible for one man to defy at once an emperor and a pope. We shall consider sympathetically the efforts of Erasmus for the peaceful self-reform of the Church. We shall study Germany on the eve of Luther, and may thereby come to understand how inevitable he was when he came. In Book 2, the Reformation proper will hold the stage, with Luther and Melanchthon in Germany, Zwingli and Calvin in Switzerland, Henry VIII in England, Knox in Scotland, and Gustavus Vasa in Sweden, with a side glance at the long duel between Francis I and Charles V. And other aspects of European life in that turbulent half-century, from 1517 to 1564, will be postponed in order to let the religious drama unfold itself without confusing delays. Book 3 will look at the strangers in the gate, Russia and the Ivans in the Orthodox Church, Islam and its challenging creed, culture, and power, and the struggle of the Jews to find Christians in Christendom. Book 4 will go behind the scenes to study the law and economy, morals and manners, art and music, literature and science and philosophy of Europe in the age of Luther. In Book 5 we shall make an experiment in empathy, shall attempt to view the Reformation from the standpoint of the imperiled Church. and we shall be forced to admire the calm audacity with which she weathered the encompassing storm. In a brief epilogue, we shall try to see the Renaissance and the Reformation, Catholicism and the Enlightenment, in the large perspective of modern history and thought. It is a fascinating but difficult subject, for almost every word that one may write about it can be disputed or give offense. I've tried to be impartial, though I know that a man's past always colors his views, and that nothing is so irritating as impartiality. The reader should be warned that I was brought up as a fervent Catholic, and that I retain grateful memories of the devoted secular priests, the learned Jesuits, and kindly nuns who bore so patiently with my brash youth. But he should note, too, that I derived much of my education from lecturing for 13 years in a Presbyterian church under the tolerant auspices of sterling Protestants like Jonathan C. Day, William Adams Brown, Henry Sloane Coffin, and Edmund Chaffee, and that many of my most faithful auditors in that Presbyterian church were Jews, whose thirst for education and understanding gave me a new insight into their people. Less than any man have I excuse for prejudice, and I feel for all creeds the warm sympathy of one who has come to learn that even the trust in reason is a precarious faith, and that we are all fragments of darkness groping for the sun. I know no more about the ultimates than the simplest urchin in the streets. I thank Dr. Arthur Upham Pope, founder of the Asia Institute, for correcting some of the errors in the chapters on Islam, Dr. Gerson Cohen, of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, for checking the pages on the Jews, my friend Harry Kaufman of Los Angeles for reviewing the section on music, and Plano Cum Corde, my wife, for her unremitting aid and illuminating comments at every stage in our cooperative labor on this book. If the reaper will stay his hand, there will be a concluding Volume 7, The Age of Reason, which should appear some 5 years hence, and should carry the story of civilization to Napoleon. There we shall make our bow and retire, deeply grateful to all who have borne the weight of these tomes on their hands, and have forgiven numberless errors in our attempt to unravel the present into its constituent past. For the present is the past rolled up for action, and the past is the present unrolled for our understanding. Will Durant, Los Angeles, May 12, 1957. Note: this volume will reckon the crown, the livre, the florin, and the ducat of the 14th and 15th centuries at $25 in the money of the United States in 1954, the franc and the shilling at $5, the écu at $15, the mark at $66.67, the pound sterling at $100. These equivalents are loose guesswork, and repeated debastements of the currencies make them still more hazardous. We note that in 1390 a student could be boarded at Oxford for 2 shillings a week. About 1424, Joan of Arc's horse cost 16 francs. About 1460, a maid in the service of Leonardo da Vinci's father received 8 florins a year. Book 1, From Wycliffe to Luther, 1300 to 1517. Chapter 1, The Roman Catholic Church, 1300 to 1517. 1. The Services of Christianity. Religion is the last subject that the intellect begins to understand. In our youth we may have resented, with proud superiority, its cherished incredibilities. In our less confident years we marvel at its prosperous survival in a secular and scientific age, its patient resurrections after whatever deadly blows by Epicurus or Lucretius or Lucian or Machiavelli or Hume or Voltaire. What are the secrets of this resilience? The wisest sage would need the perspective of 100 lives to answer adequately. He might begin by recognizing that even in the heyday of science there are innumerable phenomena for which no explanation seems forthcoming in terms of natural cause, quantitative measurement, and necessary effect. The mystery of mind still eludes the formulas of psychology, and in physics the same astonishing order of nature that makes science possible may reasonably sustain the religious faith in a cosmic intelligence. Our knowledge is a receding mirage in an expanding desert of ignorance. Now life is rarely agnostic. It assumes either a natural or a supernatural source for any unexplained phenomenon, and acts on the one assumption or the other. Only a small minority of minds can persistently suspend judgment in the face of contradictory evidence. The great majority of mankind feel compelled to ascribe mysterious entities or events to supernatural beings raised above natural law. Religion has been the worship of supernatural beings, their propitiation, solicitation, or adoration. Most men are harassed and buffeted by life, and crave supernatural assistance when natural forces fail them. They gratefully accept faiths that give dignity and hope to their existence and order and meaning to the world. They could hardly condone so patiently the careless brutalities of nature, the bloodshed and chicaneries of history, or their own tribulations and bereavements, if they could not trust that these are parts of an inscrutable but divine design. A cosmos without known cause or fate is an intellectual prison. We long to believe that the great drama has a just author and a noble end. Moreover, we covet survival, and find it hard to conceive that nature should so laboriously produce man, mind, and devotion, only to snuff them out in the maturity of their development. Science gives man ever greater powers, but ever less significance. It improves his tools and neglects his purposes. It is silent on ultimate origins, values, and aims. It gives life and history no meaning or worth that is not cancelled by death or omnivorous time. So men prefer the assurance of dogma to the diffidence of reason. Weary of perplexed thought and uncertain judgment, they welcome the guidance of an authoritative church, the catharsis of the confessional, the stability of a long-established creed. Ashamed of failure, bereaved of those they loved, darkened with sin and fearful of death, they feel themselves redeemed by divine aid, cleansed of guilt and terror, solaced and inspired with hope, and raised to a godlike and immortal destiny. Meanwhile, religion brings subtle and pervasive gifts to society and the state. Traditional rituals soothe the spirit and bind the generations. The parish church becomes a collective home, weaving individuals into a community. The cathedral rises as the product and pride of the unified municipality. Life is embellished with sacred art, and religious music pours its mollifying harmony into the soul and the group. To a moral code uncongenial to our nature and yet indispensable to civilization, religion offers supernatural sanctions and supports. An all-seeing deity, the threat of eternal punishment, the promise of eternal bliss, and commandments of no precariously human authority, but of divine origin and imperative force. Our instincts were formed during 1,000 centuries of insecurity and the chase. They fit us to be violent hunters and voracious polygamists rather than peaceable citizens. Their once necessary vigor exceeds present social need. They must be checked 100 times a day, consciously or not, to make society and civilization possible. Families and states, from ages before history, have enlisted the aid of religion to moderate the barbarous impulses of men. Parents found religion helpful in taming the willful child to modesty and self-restraint. Educators valued it as a precious means of disciplining and refining youth. Governments long since sought its cooperation in forging social order out of the disruptive egoism and natural anarchism of men. If religion had not existed, the great legislators, Hammurabi, Moses, Lycurgus, Numa Pompilius, would have invented it. They did not have to, for it arises spontaneously and repeatedly from the needs and hopes of men. Through a formative millennium, from Constantine to Dante, the Christian Church offered the gifts of religion to men and states. It molded the figure of Jesus into a divine embodiment of virtues, by which rough barbarians might be shamed into civilization. It formulated a creed that made every man's life a part, however modest, of a sublime cosmic drama. It bound each individual in a momentous relation with a God who had created him, who had spoken to him in sacred scriptures, who had therein given him a moral code, who had descended from heaven to suffer ignominy and death in atonement for the sins of humanity, and who had founded the Church as the repository of his teaching and the earthly agent of his power. Year by year the magnificent drama grew. Saints and martyrs died for the creed, and bequeathed their example and their merits to the faithful. 100 forms, 100,000 works of art, interpreted the drama and made it vivid even for letterless minds. Mary the Virgin Mother became the fairest flower of all poesy, the formative model of feminine delicacy and maternal love, the recipient of the tenderest hymns and devotions, the inspirer of majestic architecture, sculpture, painting, poetry, and music. An impressive ceremony raised daily, from 1,000,000 altars, the mystic and exalting solemnity of the Mass. Confession and penance purified the contrite sinner, prayer comforted and strengthened him, the Eucharist brought him into an awesome intimacy with Christ, the last sacraments cleansed and anointed him in expectation of paradise. Rarely had religion developed such artistry in its ministrations to mankind. The Church was at her best when, by the consolations of her creed, the magic of her ritual, the nobler morality of her adherents, the courage, zeal, and integrity of her bishops, and the superior justice of her episcopal courts, she took the place vacated by the Roman imperial government as the chief source of order and peace in the Dark Ages, approximately 524 to 1079 A.D., of the Christian world. To the Church, more than to any other institution, Europe owed the resurrection of civilization in the West after the barbarian inundation of Italy, Gaul, Britain, and Spain. Her monks developed wastelands, her monasteries gave food to the poor, education to boys, lodging to travelers. Her hospitals received the sick and the destitute. Her nunneries sheltered mateless women and directed their maternal impulses to social ends. For centuries, the nuns alone provided schooling for girls. If classic culture was not completely lost in the illiterate flood, it was because monks, while allowing or causing many pagan manuscripts to perish, copied and preserved thousands of them, and kept alive the Greek and Latin languages in which they were written. It was in ecclesiastical libraries at St. Gall, Fulda, Monte Cassino, and elsewhere that the humanists of the Renaissance found precious relics of brilliant civilizations that never heard the name of Christ. For 1,000 years, from Ambrose to Wolsey, it was the Church that trained Western Europe's teachers, scholars, judges, diplomats, and ministers of state. The medieval state rested on the Church. When the Dark Ages ended, say with the birth of Abélard, it was the Church that built the universities and the Gothic cathedrals, providing homes for the intellect as well as for the piety of men. Under her protection, the scholastic philosophers renewed the ancient attempt to interpret human life and destiny by reason. Through 9 centuries, almost all European art was inspired and financed by the Church. And even when art took a pagan color, the popes of the Renaissance continued their patronage. Music, in its higher forms, was a daughter of the Church. Above all, the Church at her zenith gave to the states of Europe an international moral code and government. Just as the Latin language, taught in the schools by the Church, served as a unifying medium for the scholarship, literature, science, and philosophy of diverse nations, and just as the Catholic, that is, universal, creed and ritual gave religious unity to a Europe not yet divided into sovereign nationalities, so the Roman Church, claiming divine establishment and spiritual leadership, proposed herself as an international court to which all rulers and states were to be morally responsible. Pope Gregory VII formulated this doctrine of a Christian republic of Europe. The Emperor Henry IV recognized it by submitting to Gregory at Canossa in 1077. A century later, a stronger emperor, Frederick Barbarossa, after a long resistance, humbled himself at Venice before a weaker pope, Alexander III. And in 1198, Pope Innocent III raised the authority and prestige of the papacy to a point when, for a time, it seemed that Gregory's ideal of a moral superstate had come to fulfillment. The great dream broke on the nature of man. The administrators of the papal judiciary proved human, biased, venal, even extortionate, and the kings and peoples, also human, resented any supernatural power. The growing wealth of France stimulated her pride of national sovereignty. Philip IV successfully challenged the authority of Pope Boniface VIII over the property of the French Church. The king's emissaries imprisoned the aged pontiff for 3 days at Anagni, and Boniface died soon afterward in 1303. In one of its basic aspects, the revolt of secular rulers against the popes, the Reformation there and then began. 2. The Church at Nadir, 1307 to 1417. Throughout the 14th century, the Church suffered political humiliation and moral decay. She had begun with the profound sincerity and devotion of Peter and Paul. She had grown into a majestic system of familial, scholastic, social, international discipline, order, and morality. She was now degenerating into a vested interest absorbed in self-perpetuation and finance. Philip IV secured the election of a Frenchman to the papacy and persuaded him to move the Holy See to Avignon on the Rhone. For 68 years, the popes were so clearly the pawns and prisoners of France that other nations gave them a rapidly diminishing reverence and revenue. The harassed pontiffs replenished their treasury by multiple levies upon the hierarchy, the monasteries, and the parishes. Every ecclesiastical appointee was required to remit to the papal curia, the administrative bureaus of the papacy, half the income of his office for the first year, or annats, and thereafter annually a tenth or tithe. A new archbishop had to pay to the pope a substantial sum for the pallium, a band of white wool that served as the confirmation and insignia of his authority. On the death of any cardinal, archbishop, bishop, or abbot, his personal possessions reverted to the papacy. In the interim between the death of an ecclesiastic and the installation of his successor, the popes received the net revenues of the benefice and were accused of prolonging this interval. Every judgment or favor obtained from the curia expected a gift in acknowledgment, and the judgment was sometimes dictated by the gift. Much of this papal taxation was a legitimate means of financing the central administration of a church functioning, with diminishing success, as the moral government of European society. Some of it, however, went to fatten ecclesiastical paunches, even to remunerate the courtesans that crowded Avignon. William Durant, Bishop of Mende, submitted to the Council of Vienne in 1311 a treatise containing these words: "The whole Church might be reformed if the Church of Rome would begin by removing evil examples from herself, by which men are scandalized, and the whole people, as it were, infected. For in all lands the Church of Rome is in ill repute, and all cry and publish it abroad that within her bosom all men, from the greatest even unto the least, have set their hearts upon covetousness. That the whole Christian folk take from the clergy pernicious examples of gluttony is clear and notorious, since the clergy feast more luxuriously than princes and kings." "Wolves are in control of the Church," cried the high Spanish prelate Alvaro Pelayo, "and feed on the blood of the Christian flock." Edward III of England, himself an adept at taxation, reminded Clement VI that the successor of the apostles was commissioned to lead the Lord's sheep to pasture, not to fleece them. In Germany, papal collectors were hunted down, imprisoned, mutilated, strangled. In 1372, the clergy of Cologne, Bonn, Xanten, and Mainz bound themselves by oath not to pay the tithe levied by Gregory XI. Amid all complaints and revolts, the popes continued to assert their absolute sovereignty over the kings of the earth. About 1324, under the patronage of John XXII, Agostino Triumphal wrote a Summa de Potestate Ecclesiastica in reply to attacks on the papacy by Marsilius of Padua and William of Ockham. "The power of the Pope," said Agostino, "is from God, whose vice-regent he is on earth. Even when he is a great sinner, he must be obeyed. He may be deposed by a general council of the Church for manifest heresy, but short of this his authority is second only to God's, and transcends that of all earthly potentates. He may dethrone kings and emperors at will, even over the protests of their people or the electors. He may annul the decrees of secular rulers, and may set aside the constitutions of states. No decree of any prince is valid unless the Pope gives it his consent. The Pope stands higher than the angels, and may receive equal reverence with the Virgin and the saints." Pope John accepted all this as following logically from the generally conceded establishment of the Church by the Son of God, and acted on it with adamantine consistency. Nevertheless, the flight of the popes from Rome and their subservience to France undermined their authority and prestige. As if to proclaim their vassalage, the Avignon pontiffs, in a total of 134 nominations to the College of Cardinals, named 113 Frenchmen. The English government fumed at the loans of the popes to the kings of France during the 100 Years' War and connived at the attacks of Wycliffe upon the papacy. The imperial electors in Germany repudiated any further interference of the popes in the election of kings and emperors. In 1372, the abbots of Cologne publicly agreed that the apostolic see has fallen into such contempt that the Catholic faith in these parts seems to be seriously imperiled. In Italy, the papal states, Latium, Umbria, the Marches, the Romagna, were seized by condottieri despots who gave the distant popes a formal obeisance, but kept the revenues. When Urban V sent 2 legates to Milan to excommunicate the recalcitrant Visconti, Bernabo compelled them to eat the bulls, parchment, silken cords, and leaden seals, this in 1362. In 1376, Florence, quarreling with Pope Gregory XI, confiscated all ecclesiastical property in its territory, closed the episcopal courts, demolished the buildings of the Inquisition, jailed or hanged resisting priests, and called upon Italy to end all temporal power of the Church. It became clear that the Avignon popes were losing Europe in their devotion to France. In 1377, Gregory XI returned the papacy to Rome. When he died in 1378, the conclave of cardinals, overwhelmingly French but fearful of the Roman mob, chose an Italian as Pope Urban VI. Urban was not urbane. He proved so violent of temper and so insistent upon reforms uncongenial to the hierarchy that the reassembled cardinals declared his election invalid as having been made under duress and proclaimed Robert of Geneva Pope. Robert assumed office as Clement VII in Avignon, while Urban persisted as pontiff in Rome. The Papal Schism, 1378 to 1417, so inaugurated, like so many of the forces that prepared the Reformation, was conditioned by the rise of the national state. In effect, it was an attempt by France to retain the moral and financial aid of the papacy in her war with England. The lead of France was followed by Naples, Spain, and Scotland. But England, Flanders, Germany, Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, Italy, and Portugal accepted Urban, and the divided church became the weapon and victim of the hostile camps. Half the Christian world held the other half to be heretical, blasphemous, and excommunicate. Each side claimed that sacraments administered by priests of the opposite obedience were worthless, and that the children so baptized, the penitents so shriven, the dying so anointed, remained in mortal sin and were doomed to hell, or at best to limbo, if death should supervene. Expanding Islam laughed at disintegrating Christendom. Urban's death in 1389 brought no compromise. The 14 cardinals in his camp chose Boniface IX, then Innocent VII, then Gregory XII, and the divided nations prolonged the divided papacy. When Clement VII died in 1394, the Avignon cardinals named a Spanish prelate to be Benedict XIII. He offered to resign if Gregory would follow suit, but Gregory's relatives, already entrenched in office, would not hear of it. Some of Gregory's cardinals abandoned him and called for a general council. The King of France urged Benedict to withdraw. Benedict refused. France renounced its allegiance to him and adopted neutrality. While Benedict fled to Spain, his cardinals joined with those who had left Gregory, and together they issued a call for a council to meet at Pisa and elect a pope acceptable to all. Rebellious philosophers, almost a century before, had laid the theoretical foundations of the conciliar movement. William of Ockham protested against identifying the Church with the clergy. The Church, he held, is the congregation of all the faithful. That whole has authority superior to any part. It may delegate its authority to a general council of all the bishops and abbots of the Church, and such a council should have the power to elect, reprove, punish, or depose the Pope. A general council, said Marsilius of Padua, is the collected wisdom of Christendom. How should any one man set up his own intellect above it? Such a council, he thought, should be composed not only of clergymen, but also of laymen chosen by the people. Heinrich von Langenstein, a German theologian at the University of Paris, applied in 1381 these ideas to the Papal Schism. Whatever logic there might be, he argued, in the claims of the popes to supremacy, a crisis had arisen from which logic offered no escape but one. Only a power outside the papacy, and superior to the cardinals, could rescue the Church from the chaos that was destroying her, and that authority could only be a general council. The Council of Pisa met on March 25, 1409. It summoned Benedict and Gregory to appear before it. They ignored it. It declared them deposed, elected a new pope, Alexander V, bade him call another council before May 1412, and adjourned. There were now 3 popes instead of 2. Alexander did not help matters by dying in 1410, for his cardinals named as his successor John the 23rd, the most unmanageable man to mount the pontifical chair since the 22nd of his name. Governing Bologna as papal vicar, this ecclesiastical condottiere, Baldassare Cosa, had permitted and taxed everything, including prostitution, gambling, and usury. According to his secretary, he had seduced 200 virgins, matrons, widows, and nuns. But he had money and an army. Perhaps he could conquer the papal states from Gregory, and so reduce him to impecunious abdication. John the 23rd delayed as long as he could the calling of the council decreed at Pisa. When he opened it at Constance on November 5, 1414, only a fraction had arrived of the 3 patriarchs, 29 cardinals, 33 archbishops, 150 bishops, 300 doctors of theology, 14 university delegates, 26 princes, 140 nobles, and 4,000 priests, who were to make the completed council the largest in Christian history, and the most important since the Council of Nicaea, in 325, had established the Trinitarian Creed of the Church. On April 6, 1415, the Great Gathering issued a proud and revolutionary decree. This Holy Synod of Constance, being a general council and legally assembled in the Holy Spirit for the praise of God, for ending the present schism, and for the union and reform of the Church in its head and members, ordains, declares, and decrees as follows. First, it declares that this synod represents the Church militant, and has its authority directly from Christ, and everybody of whatever rank or dignity, including also the Pope, is bound to obey this council in those things that pertain to the faith, to the ending of this schism, and to a general reform of the Church in its head and members. Likewise, it declares that if anyone, including also the Pope, shall refuse to obey the commands, statutes, and ordinances of this Holy Council in regard to the ending of the schism or to the reform of the Church, he shall be subject to proper punishment, and if necessary, recourse shall be had to other aids of justice. The Council demanded the abdication of Gregory XII, Benedict XIII, and John the 23rd. Receiving no answer from John, it accepted the presentation of 54 charges against him as a pagan, oppressor, liar, simoniac, traitor, lecher, and thief. 16 other accusations were suppressed as too severe. On May 29, 1415, it deposed him. Gregory was more pliant and subtle. He agreed to resign, but only on condition that he should first be allowed to reconvene the council on his own authority. So reconvened, the council accepted his resignation on July 4th. To further attest its orthodoxy, it burned at the stake, on July 6th, the Bohemian reformer John Hus. On July 26th, it declared Benedict XIII deposed. He settled in Valencia and died there at 90, still holding himself pope. On November 17, 1417, an electoral committee chose Cardinal Ottone Colonna as Pope Martin V. All Christendom acknowledged him, and the papal schism came to an end. The victory of the council in this regard defeated its other purpose, to reform the Church. Martin V at once assumed all the powers and prerogatives of the papacy. Playing off each national group of delegates against the others, he persuaded them to accept a vague and innocuous minimum of reform. The council yielded to him because it was tired. On April 22nd, 1418, it dissolved. 3. The Triumphant Papacy, 1417 to 1513. Martin reorganized the Curia to more effective functioning, but could find no way to finance it except by imitating the secular governments of the age and selling offices and services. Since the Church had survived for a century without reform, but could hardly survive a week without money, he concluded that money was more urgently needed than reform. In 1430, a year before Martin's death, a German envoy to Rome sent his prince a letter that almost sounded the theme and tocsin of the Reformation. Greed reigns supreme in the Roman court, and day by day finds new devices for extorting money from Germany. Hence much outcry and heartburnings. Many questions in regard to the papacy will arise, or else obedience will at last be entirely renounced, to escape from these outrageous exactions by the Italians, and this latter course, as I perceive, would be acceptable to many countries. Martin's successor faced the accumulated problems of the Apostolic See from the background of a devout Franciscan friar, ill-equipped for statesmanship. The papacy had to govern states as well as the church. The popes had to be men of affairs with at least one foot in the world, and could rarely afford to be saints. Eugenius IV might have been a saint had not his troubles embittered his spirit. In the first year of his pontificate, the Council of Basel proposed again to assert the supremacy of general councils over the popes. It assumed one after another traditionally papal function. It issued indulgences and dispensations, appointed to benefices, and required annates to be sent to itself instead of to the pope. Eugenius ordered it to dissolve. Instead, it declared him deposed, and named Amadeus VIII, Duke of Savoy, as anti-pope Felix V in 1439. The papal schism was renewed. To complete the apparent defeat of the papacy, Charles VII of France convened an assembly of French prelates, nobles, and lawyers, which proclaimed the superior authority of general councils and issued the pragmatic sanction of Bourges, this in 1438. Ecclesiastical offices were henceforth to be filled through election by the local clergy, but the king might make recommendations. Appeals to the papal curia were forbidden except after exhausting all judicial avenues in France, and annates were no longer to be sent to the pope. In effect, the sanction established an independent Gallican church and made the king its master. A year later, a diet at Mainz adopted resolutions aiming at a similar national church in Germany. Bohemia had already separated itself from the papacy. The whole edifice of the Roman Church seemed about to collapse. Eugenius was rescued by the Turks. As the Ottomans came ever nearer to Constantinople, the Byzantine government decided that the Greek capital was worth a Roman Mass, and that a reunion of Greek with Latin Christianity was an indispensable prelude to winning military or financial aid from the West. Greek prelates and nobles came in picturesque panoply to Ferrara, then to Florence, to meet the Roman hierarchy summoned by the Pope in 1438. After a year of argument, an accord was reached that recognized the authority of the Roman pontiff over all Christendom. And on July 6, 1439, all the members of the conference, with the Greek emperor at their head, bent the knee before that same Eugenius who had seemed so recently the most despised and rejected of men. The concord was brief, for the Greek clergy and people repudiated it, but it restored the prestige of the papacy and helped to bring the new schism and the Council of Basel to an end. A succession of strong popes, enriched and exalted by the Italian Renaissance, now raised the papacy to such splendor as it had not known even in the proud days of Innocent III. Nicholas V earned the admiration of the Humanists by devoting church revenues to the patronage of scholarship and art. Calixtus III established that genial custom of nepotism, giving offices to relatives, which became a pillar of corruption in the church. Pius II, brilliant as author and barren as pope, struggled to reform the curia and the monasteries. He appointed a commission of prelates, reputed for integrity and piety, to study the shortcomings of the church, and to this commission he made a frank confession. Two things are particularly near my heart: the war with the Turks and the reform of the Roman court. The amendment of the whole state of ecclesiastical affairs, which I have determined to undertake, depends upon this court as its model. I purpose to begin by improving the morals of ecclesiastics here and banishing all simony and other abuses. The committee made laudable recommendations, and Pius embodied them in a bull. But hardly anybody in Rome wanted reform. Every second functionary or dignitary there profited from some form of venality. Apathy and passive resistance defeated Pius, while the abortive crusade that he undertook against the Turks absorbed his energy and his funds. Toward the end of his pontificate, he addressed a final appeal to the cardinals. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.